Hello, I'm Rob, a Washington, D.C. tour guide here in East Potomac Park. It's peak bloom and I've got a GoPro camera on the front of my bike. So let's hop on so I can show you one of my favorite ways to see the blossoms. Here we go. Biking has always been one of my personal favorite ways of getting around, and this bike ride during peak bloom is definitely one of my favorites. Now, we are taking a ride through East Potomac Park. This is a huge park located on an island in the middle of the Potomac River. And on a map, it looks like a peninsula. But when you zoom in far enough, you realize it is in fact an island. And the Jefferson Memorial is also on this island, though all of the other major monuments and memorials are not. I personally consider East Potomac Park to be the area that's south of the 14th Street Bridge, though technically the bridge runs through the island. Anyway, not many tourists come here because honestly, there really aren't any tourist attractions or tourist sites here, but I'll talk about that more in a bit. So this is essentially a huge park, and it's used primarily by locals for recreation. So a few things you'll find here include a golf course, which is up on the right now. There's also a driving range that's part of that golf course, a mini golf course if that's more your speed, a tennis center, and other recreational fields, as well as kids' playgrounds and such. It's also a popular spot for fishing and, what I'm doing, cycling. People on bikes like to ride loops through the park, and in fact, this is actually my third loop of the day. The first loop I did to come check out the blossoms with no camera, just to enjoy, because even I like to enjoy the blossoms during peak bloom. The second loop I tried to record, but I had some GoPro camera troubles, and so this is my third loop, which hopefully works out. You will sometimes hear this park called Hains Point, and that's not entirely correct, because Hains Point is specifically the southernmost tip of the island, but we'll talk more about that when we get there. The street I'm riding on right now is Ohio Drive. Most tourists, I think, know that Washington, D.C. has a street grid, and it's made up of numbered streets running east and west, and then lettered streets running north and south, with avenues named after states running diagonally. The most famous of these, of course, is Pennsylvania Avenue, which has the address of the White House. Interestingly, or at least interesting to me, is that all states are avenues except for two, California Street and this one, Ohio Drive. Also interesting to me is that the street that connects Ohio Drive back to itself to form the closed loop is called Buckeye Drive, which makes sense if you know anything about Ohio. Right now to my left is the Washington Channel. Now when East Potomac Park was built, it formed a branch in the Potomac River with water flowing, I guess you could say, up the river to the Tidal Basin, into the Tidal Basin, and then out into the Washington Channel, connecting back to the Potomac River at Hains Point. The wharf is on the opposite side of the Washington Channel. I'm too far south now, can't see it anymore, but the wharf is over on the left, closer to the city. And if you take the water taxi from the wharf to Alexandria, it first goes all the way down the Washington Channel at limited speed, and then it speeds up to go the rest of the way to Alexandria. Now let me tell you about today. It's Wednesday, March 20th, 2024, the first day of spring. It's about 5:30 p.m. right now. The weather is chilly. It's in the 50s Fahrenheit, but it feels chillier because it's windy today. And I know this because this is my third lap, and the opposite side of the loop is actually quite windy today. It also smells smoky right now, which at first I thought was someone grilling, but I don't see anyone grilling. And I know there was a fire warning this morning, so I actually do think it's from a wildfire somewhere nearby. We had a ton of smoke from the wildfires in Quebec last year, and I really hate that it's becoming increasingly common to have wildfires around here. Now we're coming up on Hains Point now. To the right is I guess you could say like a recreation area. There's a kids play area over there. I'm not gonna go all the way to Hains Point because the road doesn't actually go all the way down, but Hains Point is over there. If you go all the way to the tip and you stand at Hains Point, you can see to all the way to Alexandria on a clear day. You can see Reagan National Airport across the way. Actually, straight ahead right now, I'm not sure if you can see it on camera very well, but that's Reagan National Airport right there, now to the left. Now, Hains Point is named in memory of Peter Conover Hains, Major General in the U.S. Army. He's the designer of the Tidal Basin, which was a much needed, desperately needed project around the turn of the last century. Washington, D.C. was selected to be the capital, and the location was chosen by George Washington at the spot where the Potomac and Anacostia rivers come together. But if you look at old maps from the 1800s, you'll notice this park didn't exist. Neither did West Potomac Park, which is the area that most people call the National Mall and where the Lincoln Memorial and other national monuments are located. So the location of Washington, D.C. was actually not a great one because it was prone to flooding and other drainage problems. And so thus the need to create the tidal basin, which, as the name suggests, is to control the tides. And it worked for a long time, but it's not working so well anymore. I'm going to do a walking tour around the tidal basin, and I will explain what's going on, the reason why they're having a brand new project to rebuild the seawall, and why it's all such a big deal. So I'll cover that in this year's virtual walking tour, which will be on YouTube soon. Now, you tuned into this because you wanted to see cherry blossoms, of course, and most of what you're seeing, most of these cherry trees are the Yoshino cherry, which make up about 70% of the total cherry trees in DC. The Yoshino cherry is a white single blossom. They were first discovered in Tokyo in the 1800s, and it's now one of the favorite cherry trees of Japan. And of course, one of the favorite cherry trees in Washington, D.C. as well. When you hear people talking about peak bloom, I started off talking about peak bloom, they are specifically talking about the Yoshino cherry. We also have about a dozen total varieties of cherry trees. Coming up on the right, you're going to see some trees that look somewhat barren, and that's because they are Kwanzan cherry trees. And the Kwanzans are the second most common cherry trees in DC. Here they come up on the right. These are the Kwanzans, and they are not in bloom yet. They are still in the process of blossoming. They are a pink colored double blossom, which means that there are 2 blossoms per bud. They're late bloomers. They're usually 2 weeks behind the Yoshino. So there's a whole bunch of them up here on the right. So we've got Yoshinos on the left, we've got Kwanzans on the right. If you come back in about 2 weeks, you'll be able to see the Kwanzans in bloom. I'll edit one on the screen right now so you can see generally what it looks like. But if you do come to DC for spring break, you miss peak bloom, the good news is you can still see something in bloom, usually the Kwanzans. Now, like I said, we had a very early peak bloom this year. If you're thinking, hey, it's March 20th, this is way too early for the cherry blossoms to look like this, your instinct is not wrong. We had peak bloom declared on March 17th. That is tied for the second earliest bloom in DC. Peak bloom is notoriously difficult to time. It is entirely weather dependent, and we had some very warm days last week, including several days where the temperature got up into the 70s. So it's not surprising to me that we had such an early bloom, but it is a bit unfortunate because an early bloom means that you might have the bloom and then a bunch of cold days, or seasonably cold, to be honest with you, chilly days. Today is probably the nicest day of the week. The reason I'm out here today versus yesterday or tomorrow is because I checked the forecast and I said, today looks like the day. So Thursday, Friday are looking a bit chilly. Saturday, the forecast is calling for heavy rain. Of course, it's still quite a few days out and it could change, but as of now, it's looking like potentially heavy rain this Saturday. Now, this area, East Potomac Park, is under the jurisdiction of the National Park Service. And most people know the National Park Service because they manage the big national parks. The Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Sequoia, Shenandoah National Park is the closest one to us here in DC. They're also in charge of national historical parks, national historical sites, national monuments, national recreation areas, other things like that. And there's actually, I'm bringing this up because there is a new article just published in Politico magazine titled, "America's Most Popular Federal Agency is Weirdly Hated in Washington." And this article really resonated with me because if you're interested in this topic at all, if you're very nerdy about the national parks or bureaucracy or how these things work, highly recommend giving it a read. But the Cliff Notes version is that the National Park Service has a very wide mission, And what they need to do to properly manage a huge park like the Grand Canyon is very different than what they need to do to manage an urban park in a big city like this one or like the National Mall. And so there are some frustrations that we have to deal with here, and a lot of years when it feels like this is great, but it could be so much better, it could be so much greater. So again, highly recommend checking out that article. I'm crossing Buckeye Drive right now. If I was going to do this loop again, I would have turned right and done the loop again if I was going to do it again in the clockwise direction. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap it up because I just wanted to do a quick video to show you one of my favorite bike rides, tell you about East Potomac Park, and let you see what it's like when you're here during peak bloom. So make sure to check out my a little bit longer, a little bit more in-depth and details virtual walking tour of the Tidal Basin. I've done one every year for the last 4 years. I just recorded one earlier today in 2024, so it should be up by the time you're watching this. And if it's not yet, make sure you're subscribed so that you don't miss it. And if you're coming this year during spring break, I highly recommend watching next my video for experiencing the cherry blossoms in Washington, D.C. I've got lots of great tips for you. Look for that video popping up right now on the left side of your screen. And as I often say, enjoy your trip.